Hello everyone, before this video starts, I would appreciate if you guys would leave a like and subscribe, since your support means the world to me and allows me to make these types of videos. Now let's get into the video. We were lucky to survive. That was what I believed. When I woke in the hospital bed, I dismissed my broken wrist and the pulsating pain in my stitched brow. I was simply relieved that James was sitting by my bedside, holding my hand. His face bore a few cuts and bruises, but he was alive, and the wounds were shallow, barely scrapes. My husband looked well, far better than I looked. "Lillian," he smiled. "You're awake." I sobbed, clutching his hand tightly. "Do you remember what happened?" my husband asked. I gulped. "We were driving home. There was a bridge. You swerved because, I don't know. We crashed." James nodded solemnly, though his demeanor felt strange to me. "I'm so sorry, Lillian." I took my eyes off the road and, "Are you okay?" I interrupted. "Did something else happen?" James tilted his head in an odd manner. "What do you mean?" I frowned. "You keep calling me Lillian." "That's your name, isn't it?" he replied in an emotionless tone. "You never call me anything but Lil," I said, raising an eyebrow. "So, why are you being weird?" James paused as if cogs were whirring in his brain. "Well, I was just thinking." "Thinking?" I asked. He nodded. "Thinking about why we crashed." I gulped. "I remember that there was something in the road." James's mouth twitched. "They never found anything. No animal or body." I suddenly felt very foolish. "I'm sorry, darling. I didn't mean to." "Of course you're not yourself. This must have been traumatic for you." And that was all the excuse my husband needed. He didn't get any better. The first truly strange experience took place a week or so later, after I was released from the hospital and returned home. I stirred in the middle of the night, neck hairs pricking my pillow. Like those alert strands, I rose to attention, and my eyelids flew apart. I didn't know why at first, but then I felt it. A thick cloud of breath, reeking of festering sewage that weighed against my flesh. It didn't smell like the man I loved, but when I rolled over, James was certainly the one breathing heavily. My husband lay on his back, stiff as a board, but his eyes were facing me, eyes wide open. "Honey?" I asked timidly. James didn't reply. He was locked onto me, seemingly unable to blink, and then he suddenly held his breath, caught himself mid-exhale and twisted his head to face the ceiling above. His eyes didn't close, and his breathing didn't resume. We lay there for an hour. Not a sound came from my husband. At the time, I didn't believe that he'd truly been holding his breath for an hour. I told myself that it had all been a dream, or sleep deprivation had muddled my brain. "Take your pick, Lillian. Either way, you've lost it," I fearfully and unconvincingly told myself. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I woke with a fuzzy brain and an empty bed. I planned to ask James what was wrong when he got home, but I didn't. I didn't have the stomach for it. Something was different about my husband, and it wasn't trauma. No, it was something more than that. I feared him, and I didn't even have a good reason for doing so. But I would. When I first saw it, my brain did nothing with the information. I was getting ready for work, running on autopilot. Very little is processed by my morning brain. It was whilst I tucked into my sandwich at lunch that a thought violently burst into my brain. What the fuck was next to the sink? I remembered that I'd been grimacing whilst brushing my teeth. James isn't the most hygienic man in the world, so it's not unusual for me to turn my nose up at the mess and muck he leaves in his wake. However, I hadn't recoiled at the sight of facial hair or spilled toothpaste. The filth had been a small, mushy smear of red and brown, something that I was struggling to place even whilst recalling it with a clear head. I'd been too tired to clean it up, too distracted by thoughts of ongoing work projects and upcoming meetings. Upon finally slamming the brakes and deactivating unconscious mode, I processed everything, the disgust of whatever I'd seen. But an idea came to me. It sparked a euphoric rush that quickly replaced the fear, the sensation of solving a niggling mystery. "It was a squashed bug," I whispered, chuckling as I realized that I'd spoken aloud and drawn attention from confused coworkers. How silly of me, I thought. Why on earth was I anxious? Was I honestly flustered about James squishing an insect? Come on, Lillian. You've done that 1,000 times. You'll clean it up later. Or ask him to do it. But it's no big deal. Relax. I tried to stop berating myself. It was my first day back at work, after all, and I was still recovering from a severe car accident. I shouldn't have diminished the struggle of recovering from the emotional and physical strain that came with the crash. It had bludgeoned my overall well-being. Yes, I'd survived. Yes, I'd physically healed. But a near brush with death will psychologically derail even the most stable and well-adjusted person. It might even make one believe that something has happened to her husband, I thought, sighing. I felt so foolish, so dramatic as always for letting emotions rule me. James had been so patient in spite of my mistrust, and I felt incredibly guilty for doubting him. So I thought about what I could do to make amends. A Thai takeaway in Donnie Darko, his favorite food and his favorite film. The perfect solution. That would mend the recent rift in our relationship. I was certain of it. The rest of the workday raced by as I eagerly anticipated the romantic evening I was planning in my head. An evening that would put the unpleasantness of the previous week behind us. I dropped James a text telling him that dinner was going to blow his socks off. I'm hungry. That was his slightly blunt response. A little peculiar and verging on rude, depending on how a person interprets it, but I chose to interpret it positively. On my drive home, I almost ran a red light in excitement. I find talk of a love languages a little cringeworthy, but I suppose if I were to slap a label on myself, I'd be a gift giver. That's how I show my feelings. I was eager to make everything better. There was no doubt in my mind that I'd driven James to behave strangely by behaving strangely myself. I hadn't displayed love or affection in the ways I usually did. You're such a tool, I thought as I pulled onto the driveway. I dialed the number for the local takeaway whilst I walked up the front path, and the order was placed before I'd even slipped off my black loafers. I scurried around the lounge, making the room look warm, inviting, and romantic. Then I waited for James and the delivery driver. Both should have arrived within half an hour of me arriving home. After an hour without any sign of either, I started to worry and called James. He didn't answer. Are you okay, honey? I asked, leaving a worried voicemail. I know I've been a little off this week, but it's been... Well, you know that it's been strange, and I want to make up for that. Please. Look, I don't want to spoil anything, but I've got a lovely surprise for you here, so if you... Knocking interrupted me. Sorry, the takeaway's finally here. That was a ridiculously long wait. I thought you'd be here by now, but don't worry. I'll heat up the food when you get home. I just hope you've not been held up at work. Love you, I sighed, hanging up. I answered the door to Mike, the usual acne-ridden teenager who did the deliveries for the Thai place. He was the kid of a neighbor at the end of the road. We'd known him for years, and I could see that something was different about him. It was a primal sensation, a feeling beyond fear. It was a warning from my brain, a warning that my eyes were unable to comprehend what they were seeing. My body was unable to comprehend what it was feeling. There was nothing natural about Mike, and that only became clearer once he smiled with outstretched hands. Hands which trembled with fear or exhilaration. I didn't know which one, and I wasn't sure which would be worse. Got your food, he whispered. I smiled uncomfortably. Yes, I see that, Mike. Thank you. Give my best to your mother, won't you? I saw something which I wish I could erase from my mind. Something I wish I could erase from reality. A shape swam out of his mouth. It was not a tongue running between chapped, crusty lips. It was a small, slithery, brown thing. A living thing, followed by an identical companion. A frightened sound unwillingly emerged from the pit of my body, and I quickly clasped one hand to my mouth, whilst hurriedly using the other to snatch the plastic bag from the boy. It was too late. I'd already reacted, the look in my eyes, the hand on my lips. I didn't exactly hide my fear, and there'd been no point in silencing myself. He'd already heard my reaction, seen that I'd seen. Not that I had any way of knowing what I'd seen. I wish I still had that privilege. The teenager responded to my sound of horror with a slight giggle, a giggle that grew as I slowly began to shut the door. I was too afraid to slam it in a swift motion in case the boy on my doorstep were to react dangerously. He haunted me, and in the sliver of the ajar door, moments before I closed it, I saw something else. Wriggling shapes. Red worms, like the ones I'd seen on the boy's lips, began to burst through the blemishes on his face. They slipped through petrifying pimples that weren't really pimples at all. Just as that thing wasn't Mike at all. I finally closed the door and locked it, whilst my heart thumped without rhythm. I could hear the boy breathing on the other side of the door and my body shook. I thought about calling the police, thought about screaming at him to go away. "He didn't want the delivery," Mike tittered erratically. Footsteps padded away, and I tried to process what the boy had said. It made no sense. The haunting pieces of the puzzle were there, but nothing meant anything. Not until James spoke. "Didn't you hear me, sweetie?" my husband cooed. The unexpected voice struck my heart with a thunderous bolt of fear, and I spun around to see James standing in the doorway to the living room. His face was clumsily painted with a smile that looked poorly learnt, as if he had never seen true joy, never seen a true person. It was a terrifying performance from a thing that had walked among humans for a week. I knew then what I'd suspected for days. This was not my husband. "Here, what?" I whimpered, stalling for time as I fumbled with the door handle behind me. "Hear me come home, Lillian," he chuckled. "I told the delivery boy we wouldn't be needing the food. I see you've collected it anyway. That's fine. I know how it feels to be hungry. Listen, sweetie, His hand shot to the light switch, and the lobby was plunged into darkness. I yelped in fright, dropping the bag to the floor, and James's heavy shoes clomped across the tiles towards me. I screamed as fingers gripped my shoulders, and the thing with my husband's face tossed me to the ground like a limp doll. He climbed on top of me, suffocating me beneath his inexplicable weight. I saw very little in the darkness, but I felt that awful breath on my pupils, a moldy, earthy aroma that slithered under my eyelids. Staleness, looking for somewhere cozy to hibernate. That was how I chose to understand it, as I squinted at James's eyes in the blackness. Eyes which spilled a torrent of dark liquid. A squirming liquid, breaking into solid parts. Ravenous creatures were tumbling out of every discernible orifice, and I knew that these things had claimed James's body as a home. His mind too. I wondered whether, inside his body, there might be nothing left but those dreadful creatures. No bones or organs. Simply worms. Creatures that had filled the delivery boy in the same way. Creatures that were on the verge of taking me. "No!" I screamed. My hand wrapped around the base of the nearby coat stand, and I yanked. It toppled onto James's head. He flew backwards, disappearing into the darkness, and I immediately leapt to my feet, shrieking as I felt something slip from my cheek. Something that had been all too close to entering one of my nostrils. I opened the front door, and everything came flooding back to me. As I ran into the street, I was haunted by a memory of the seconds that preceded the car accident. James had swerved into the barrier of the bridge, swerved to avoid not a person, nor an animal, but a mass of united creatures. A traveling mass of worm-like horrors. Thank you for watching the video fully. Please hit the like and subscribe button, since I could not make these videos without your support, and it means the world to me.